The flag signals from the mountain and the messages from Rosser became more intense in their warning and more frequent as the hours passed. Sheridan's marchers were coming closer and massing in heavy column on the left, while his cavalry were gathering on our flank and rear. But the commander of the Confederate forces evidently did not share in the apprehension manifested by the warning signals as to the danger which immediately threatened us. When the battle began in the morning, my command was on the Confederate right, but at the end of the morning's fight, when the fatal halt was called, my immediate division was on the Confederate left. General Early, in his report, now published, states that I had gotten on the left with my division. He did not seem to understand how we reached the left when we were on the right at the opening of the morning fight. Had General Early been there when our ringing rifles were sounding a reveille to Sheridan's sleeping braves, had he seen Evans and Kershaw as I saw them, sweeping with the scattering fury of a whirlwind down the Union entrenchments and following the flying Federals far beyond our extreme left, he would have known exactly how we got there. From the Confederate right to the Confederate left, we had passed in swift pursuit of the routed enemy. Across the whole length of the Confederate front, these divisions had swept, trying to catch Sheridan's panic-stricken men, and they did catch a great many of them. When the long hours of dallying with the 6th Union Corps had passed and our afternoon alignment was made, there was a long gap, with scarcely a vedette to guard it, between my right and the main Confederate line. The flapping flags from the mountain and the messages from Rosser were burdened with warnings that the rallied Union infantry and heavy bodies of cavalry were already in front of the gap and threatening both flank and rear. With that fearful gap in the line and the appalling conditions which our long delay had invited, every Confederate commander of our left wing foresaw the crash which speedily came. One after another of my staff was directed to ride with all speed to General Early and apprise him of the hazardous situation. Receiving no satisfactory answer, I myself finally rode to headquarters to urge that he reinforce the left and fill the gap, which would prove a veritable death trap if left open many minutes longer, or else that he concentrate his entire force for desperate defence or immediate withdrawal. He instructed me to stretch out the already weak lines and take a battery of guns to the left. I rode back at a furious gallop to execute these most unpromising movements. It was too late. The last chance had passed of saving the army from the doom which had been threatened for hours. Major Kirkpatrick had started with his guns, rushing across the plain to the crumbling Confederate lines like fire engines tearing through streets in the vain effort to save a building already wrapped in flames and tumbling to the ground. I reached my command only in time to find the unresisted columns of Sheridan rushing through this gap, and, worse still, to find Clement A. Evans, whom I left in command, almost completely surrounded by literally overwhelming numbers. But he was handling the men with great skill and fighting in almost every direction with characteristic coolness. It required countercharges of the most daring character to prevent the utter destruction of the command and effect its withdrawal. At the same instant, additional Union forces, which had penetrated through the vacant space, were assailing our main line on the flank and rolling it up like a scroll. Regiment after regiment, brigade after brigade, in rapid succession was crushed, and like hard clods of clay under a pelting rain, the superb commands crumbled to pieces. The sun was sinking, but the spasmodic battle still raged. Wrapped in clouds of smoke and gathering darkness, the overpowered Confederates stubbornly yielded before the advancing Federals. There was no yelling on the one side, nor huzzas on the other. The gleaming blazes from hot muzzles made the murky twilight lurid. The line of light from Confederate guns grew shorter and resistance fainter. The steady roll of musketry, punctuated now and then by peals of thunder from retreating or advancing batteries, suddenly ceased, and resistance ended as the last organized regiment of Early's literally overwhelmed army broke and fled in the darkness. As the tumult of battle died away, there came from the north side of the plain a dull, heavy swelling sound, like the roaring of a distant cyclone, the omen of additional disaster. It was unmistakable. Sheridan's horsemen were riding furiously across the open fields of grass to intercept the Confederates before they crossed Cedar Creek. Many were cut off and captured. As the sullen roar from horses' hooves beating the soft turf of the plain told of the near approach of the cavalry, all effort at orderly retreat was abandoned. The only possibility of saving the rear regiments was in unrestrained flight, every man for himself. Mounted officers gathered here and there squads of brave men who poured volleys into the advancing lines of blue, but it was too late to make effective resistance. In the dim starlight, after crossing the creek, I gathered around me a small force representing nearly every command in Early's army, intending to check, if possible, the further pursuit, or at least to delay it long enough to enable the shattered and rapidly retreating fragments to escape. The brave fellows responded to my call and formed a line across the pike. The effort was utterly fruitless, however, and resulted only in hairbreadth escapes and unexampled experiences. It has never been settled whether, in escaping from the British dragoons under Tryon, General Israel Putnam rode or rolled or slid down the precipice at Horseneck in 1779. But whichever method of escape he adopted, I can go him two better, as the sportsmen say, for I did all three at Cedar Creek 85 years later, in escaping from American dragoons under Philip Sheridan. At the point where I attempted to make a stand at night, the pike ran immediately on the edge of one of those abrupt and rugged limestone cliffs down which it was supposed not even a rabbit could plunge without breaking his neck, and I proved it to be nearly true. One end of my short line of grey jackets rested on the pike at this forbidding precipice. I had scarcely gotten my men in position when I discovered that Sheridan's dragoons had crossed the creek higher up, and that I was surrounded by them on three sides, while on the other was this breakneck escarpment. These enterprising horsemen in search of their game had located my little band, and at the sound of the bugle they came in headlong charge. Only one volley from my men and the Federal cavalry were upon them. Realizing that our capture was imminent, I shouted to my men to escape, if possible, in the darkness. 1 minute more, and I should have had a Yankee carbine at my head, inviting my surrender. The alternatives were the precipice or Yankee prison. There was no time to debate the question, not a moment. Wheeling my horse to the dismal brink, I drove my spurs into his flanks, and he plunged downward and tumbled headlong in one direction, sending me in another. How I reached the bottom of that abyss I shall never know, for I was rendered temporarily unconscious. Strangely enough, I was only stunned, and in no way seriously hurt. My horse, too, though bruised, was not disabled. For a moment I thought he was dead, for he lay motionless and prone at full length. However, he promptly responded to my call and rose to his feet, and although the bare places on his head and hips showed that he had been hurt, he was ready without a groan to bear me again in any direction I might wish to go. The question was, which way to go? I was alone in that dark wooded glen. That is, my faithful horse was the only comrade and friend near enough to aid me. I was safe enough from discovery, although so near the pike that the rumble of wheels and even the orders of the Union officers were at times quite audible. It was perhaps an hour or more after nightfall, and yet the vanguard of Sheridan's army had not halted. Considerable numbers of them were now between me and the retreating Confederates. The greater part of the country on each side of the pike, however, was open, and I was fairly familiar with it all. There was no serious difficulty, therefore, in passing around the Union forces, who soon went into camp for the night. Lonely, thoughtful, and sad, sadder and more thoughtful if possible, on this 19th night of October than on the corresponding night of the previous month at Winchester, I rode through open fields, now and then finding squads of Confederates avoiding the pike to escape capture, and occasionally a solitary soldier as lonely, if not as sad and thoughtful, as I. Thus ended the day which had witnessed a most brilliant victory converted into one of the most complete and ruinous routes of the entire war. It makes one dizzy to think of such a headlong descent from the Elysium of triumph to the Erebus of complete collapse. Chapter 25. The Fatal Halt at Cedar Creek. The sun in his circuit shines on few lovelier landscapes than that of Cedar Creek in the Valley of Virginia, which was the wrestling ground of the two armies on October 19, 1864, and no day in the Great War's calendar, nor in the chronicles of any other war, so far as my knowledge extends, was filled with such great surprises, so much of the unexpected to both armies. Other days during our war witnessed a brilliant triumph or a crushing defeat for the one army or the other, but no other single day saw each of the contending armies victorious and vanquished on the same field and between the rising and setting of the same sun. This 19th day of October, therefore, is, I believe, the most unique day in the annals of war. It was Derby Day for fleet-footed racers on both sides, and the combined experiences of the two combatants during this single day constitute the very climax of battle-born antitheses. Thomas Goctor Jones, since Governor of Alabama and now Judge of the United States Court, was then an aide on my staff and sat on his horse at my side when General Early announced that we had had glory enough for one day. Boy-soldier as he was then, he felt and expressed serious forebodings of the disaster which was to follow in the wake of our great victory. It was the anniversary of Yorktown and of the surrender of Cornwallis to Washington, which virtually ended the struggle of our fathers for liberty. After General Early consented to adopt the plan which had been submitted and urged, members of my staff and others, reposing implicit faith in the fulfillment of my predictions of a crushing defeat to Sheridan's army, confidently anticipated that the next morning, October 19, 1864, would witness for the Confederates, who were fighting for Southern independence, a victory almost as signal as that won October 19, 1781, by the rebels of the Revolution, who were fighting for American independence. It is true that the conditions surrounding the Confederate cause in the autumn of 1864 were far more desperate than those around the American revolutionists in the autumn of 1781. There were, however, in our calculations, elements which still inspired hope. If General Sheridan's army could be crushed and large numbers captured, if it could be even disorganized and dispersed, new life and vigor would be given to the still defiant Confederacy. If the victory of the coming morning, which seemed assured, should be followed by incessant blows and pressing pursuit, it would open the way to Washington, expose northern states to immediate invasion, magnify to northern apprehension the numbers and effectiveness of Early's army, compel General Grant to send a larger force than Sheridan's to meet us, enable General Lee at Petersburg to assume the offensive and possibly arouse a strong peace sentiment among the northern masses. The complete surprise of the Union Army and the resistless Confederate charges at dawn in flank, front, and rear vindicated the confident predictions of victory. The disastrous Confederate defeat in the evening made clear the mistake of hesitating and halting, which were a fatal abandonment of an essential part of the plan. The story is short and simple, but sombre to the last degree. To briefly recapitulate, orders from headquarters put an end in the early morning to concentration and energetic pursuit, and therefore to all hope of completing the great victory by capturing or crushing the last intervening line in blue between us and the Potomac. General Cullen A. Battle of Alabama was severely wounded while leading his men with characteristic dash and enthusiasm, but his brigade, one of the smallest and also one of the pluckiest, charged a battery supported by the 6th Corps, the only one left, and captured in open field 6 additional pieces of artillery. What would have been the inevitable result of the concentrated enfilade fire from all of Carter's guns tearing through the whole length of that line, while the entire army of Confederate infantry assailed it in front, flank, and rear? History, so called, does not always give a true diagnosis of the cases it deals with and attempts to analyze. It will be a long time, I fear, before all the records of the great fight between the states will tell, like sworn witnesses in the courts, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I am writing reminiscences, but if they are to be of any value, they must also stand the test applied to witnesses in courts of justice. The unexpected and unexplained absence of my official report of Cedar Creek from the list of those published with General Early's in the war records makes clear my duty to record in these reminiscences some statements which appear to me essential to the truth of history. Captain Jed Hotchkiss, of General Early's staff, has fortunately left a journal in which he recorded events as they occurred day by day. In that journal, which has been published by the government among official papers in the records of the War of the Rebellion, made at the time this memorandum. Saturday, October 29th. A contention between Generals Gordon and Early about the Battle of Cedar Creek, etc. There were a number of strongly controverted points between us, but the only one in which the whole country is concerned, involving as it does the character of Southern soldiery, the only one which I feel compelled to notice in this book, is the question as to the responsibility for the disaster at Cedar Creek after the signal victory had been won. 2 reasons have been given for this revulsion, and both have evoked no little discussion. If General Sheridan and his friends had been consulted, they doubtless would have added a third, namely his arrival on the field. This, however, was not considered by General Early and myself, and it did not disturb the harmony of our councils. We had widely differing explanations for the disaster, but neither of us suggested General Sheridan's arrival as the cause. General Early insisted, and so stated in his now published report, that the bad conduct of his own men caused the astounding disaster, while I was convinced that it was due solely to the unfortunate halting and delay after the morning victory. I insisted then, and still insist, that our men deserved only unstinted praise. I believed then, and I believe now, that neither General Sheridan nor any other commander could have prevented the complete destruction of his infantry if in the early hours of the morning we had concentrated our fire and assaults upon his only remaining corps. The situation was this. 2/3 of Sheridan's army had been shattered by blows delivered in flank and rear. If, therefore, Early's entire army, triumphant, unhurt, and exhilarated, had been instantly hurled against that solitary cause in accordance with the general plan of the battle, it is certain that there would not have been left in it an organized company. And many hours before General Sheridan made his ride, the last nucleus around which he could possibly have rallied his shattered and flying forces would have been destroyed. If my official report of the Battle of Cedar Creek had been published with General Early's, it would perhaps not be necessary for me to speak of the contention mentioned by Captain Hotchkiss in his journal, which I have recently seen for the first time. Justice to others, however, to the living and the dead, demands that I now make record in this book of some facts connected with that contention, and that I send to posterity this record in connection with his report. Thousands of living men and hundreds of thousands of their descendants, and of the descendants of those who fell heroically fighting under the Southern flag, have a profound, a measureless interest in the final settlement of that controverted point of which I am now to speak from personal knowledge, and from the testimony of scores of witnesses who participated in the battle and whose military acumen and experience give special weight to their words. It is due to General Early to say that his physical strength was not sufficient to enable him to ascend Massanutten Mountain and survey the field from that lofty peak. He had not, therefore, the opportunity to take in the tremendous possibilities which that view revealed. He had not been permitted to stand upon that summit and trace with his own eye the inviting lines for the Confederate night march. To see for himself, in the conditions immediately before him, the sure prophecy of Confederate victory, and to have his brain set on fire by clearly perceiving that the movement, if adopted and executed with vigour and pressed to the end, must inevitably result in bringing to Sheridan's army in quick succession complete surprise, universal dismay, boundless panic, and finally rout, capture, or annihilation. Again, General Early was not on that portion of the field which was struck by the Confederate cyclone at dawn, nor did he witness its destructive sweep through Sheridan's camps and along his breastworks, leaving in its wide track not a Federal soldier with arms in his hands. Major Hunter, my chief of staff, rode back to meet General Early, with instructions to give him my compliments and inform him that 2/3 of Sheridan's army were routed and nearly all his artillery captured, while our troops had suffered no serious loss. The Confederate commander was naturally elated and felt that we had had glory enough for one day. He therefore halted. The pressing question is, was that halt fatal? Was it responsible for the afternoon disaster, or was the bad conduct of the men responsible? This question was the cause of the contention of which Captain Hotchkiss made record, and which, in view of the absence of my report from the published records, and under the inexorable demands of duty to living and dead comrades, I am bound to answer in perfect fairness, but also with truth and candour. General Sheridan, in his official report of Cedar Creek, speaking of the heavy turning column, my command, which crossed the river at Bowman's Ford, describes the assault as striking Crook, who held the left of our line in flank and rear, so unexpectedly and forcibly as to drive in his outposts, invade his camp, and turn his position. This was followed by a direct attack upon our front. This was Kershaw's assault, and the result was that the whole army was driven back in confusion to a point about 1.5 miles north of Middletown, a very large portion of the infantry not even preserving a company organisation. He adds that about 9 o'clock, on reaching Mill Creek, 1/2 mile south of Winchester, the head of the fugitives appeared in sight, trains and men coming to the rear with appalling rapidity. He left officers to do what they could in stemming the torrent of fugitives. This frank statement of General Sheridan makes plain the truth that the exultant Confederates were halted at the time when the whole Army Union had been driven back in confusion, when there was not left in a large portion of Union infantry a company organisation, and when the torrent of fugitives had gone to the rear with such appalling rapidity as to have reached Mill Creek 8 or 10 miles away by 9 o'clock in the morning. I submit that I might rest the whole of my contention on these remarkable admissions of General Sheridan as to the condition of his army when the fatal Confederate halt was ordered. General Sheridan also states that the attack in flank and rear, which was made by my troops, was followed by one in front. This latter was promptly and superbly made by Kershaw. General Sheridan's statement clearly shows that the assault of my command preceded, but was promptly followed by Kershaw's. Captain Hotchkiss of General Early's staff records in his journal, penned at the time, precisely the same facts, Volume X3, Pier 581. These official records from both sides render it unnecessary for me to make any reply whatever to General Early's intimation in his report that I was a little late in making my attack at Cedar Creek. A vast array of testimony, Federal and Confederate, is at hand showing conclusively that General Early was mistaken in supposing that my command was late on that October morning. Colonel Thomas H. Carter, General Early's chief of artillery on this field, and now the honoured proctor of the University of Virginia, writes me from the university. I confirm with emphasis your opinion that General Early made a fatal mistake in stopping the pursuit of the enemy, with the 6th Corps retiring before artillery alone, and the other 2 corps in full and disorganised flight at 9 o'clock in the morning. Captain Southall's letter will show plainly my views as expressed to General Early in his presence. Captain S.V. Southall, now of Charlottesville, Virginia, in the letter to which Colonel Carter refers, in speaking of General Early at the moment he received the news of the morning victory, says, "His face became radiant with joy, and in his gladness he exclaimed, 'The son of Middletown! The son of Middletown!'" The last of Sheridan's army in its retreat had then reached the borders of Middletown. Captain Southall then reminds Colonel Carter of his suggesting to General Early the propriety of advancing, and says, "Your suggestion looking to the completion of our victory was ignored. Things remained in this way for hours, during which time Sheridan returned." Colonel Carter, in his own letter on that point, says, "At a later interview with General Early, I explained that the troops were eager to go ahead, and I had been questioned all along the line to know the cause of the delay. Of course, Sheridan, finding his cavalry corps intact and equal in number to our army, and the 6th Corps unbroken, though demoralised, was right to assume the offensive, and his ride on the Black Horse will go down in history and romance as a tribute to his military fame. Nevertheless, if we had done our proper part in pursuit, his arrival would have accomplished nothing. Every practical fighting man in our war knows that troops scattered and panic-stricken cannot be rallied in the face of hot and vigorous pursuit. Major E. W. Hunter, who was all day actively participating in the battle, speaking of the destruction of 2/3 of the Union Army by that flank and rear attack, says in his written statement of facts, "Neither the famous Macedonian phalanx, nor Caesar's 10th Legion, nor the Old Guard of Napoleon, nor Wellington's hollow squares, which saved him at Waterloo, nor any possible organisation of troops, could have withstood the combined assault of infantry, artillery and cavalry that it was in our power to have made upon the 6th Corps on that eventful morning after the complete rout of the 8th and 19th Corps. Why was not that concentrated assault made?" Shortly after the Battle of Cedar Creek, the newspapers were filled with descriptions of the morning victory and evening rout. That contention between General Early and myself was inaugurated by his intimation, in the presence of other officers, that I had inspired some of those accounts. Notwithstanding my appreciation of General Early's high qualities, and in spite of the official courtesy due him as my superior officer, which, I believe, was never ignored, I could not do less than indignantly resent the injustice of such an intimation. At the same time, my sense of duty to the army and regard for truth compelled me candidly to say, and I did say, that the facts had been truly stated as to our unfortunate halt and fatal delay. General Clement A. Evans, whose superb record as a soldier and exalted character as a man and minister of the gospel entitle any statement from him to unquestioning belief, was a division commander in the moving attack which swept away Sheridan's 2 corps. General Evans is now at the head of the Board of Pardons of the state of Georgia, and learning that I was writing of Cedar Creek, sent me a strong letter, from which I make a brief quotation. His statements fully corroborate those made at the time in the newspaper reports. For reasons which will be readily understood, I omit from the quotation the words used by General Evans as to the credit for the morning victory and the responsibility for the evening disaster, and give only this concluding clause. "And the Cedar Creek disaster was caused by the halt which you did not order, and which I know you opposed." General Thomas L. Rosser, who commanded the Confederate cavalry on the field, says, "The sun never rose on a more glorious victory, and never set on a more inglorious defeat. Had the fight continued, as it was so gloriously begun, Sheridan's ride of 20 miles away would never have been sung," etc. General Gabriel C. Wharton, now of Radford, Virginia, who commanded a division of General Early's army at Cedar Creek, speaking of some movements by our troops just after the rout of Sheridan's 2 corps, says, "I supposed we were arranging for a general movement to the front, and expected every minute orders to advance. But no orders came, and there we stood no enemy in our front for hours, except some troops moving about in the woodland on a hill nearly a mile in our front." He adds, "I have never been able to understand why General Early did not advance, or why he remained in line for 4 or 5 hours after the brilliant victory of the morning." Captain Hotchkiss, in his contribution to the recently published Confederate Military History, Volume 3, Poem 509, after paying to his old chief, General Early, the compliments which he richly deserved as an able strategist, most skillful commander, and one of the bravest of the brave, nevertheless characterizes the fatal halt at Cedar Creek as this inexcusable delay. I also present another item of testimony, which was given under most interesting circumstances. During the winter which followed this battle, there occurred, in connection with this Valley campaign, one of the most thrilling incidents of the entire war. It exhibited as much daring and dash as the famous scouting expedition of the brave Federal squad who came into Georgia and scouted in rear of our army, and then, seizing an engine on the Western and Atlantic Railroad, fled upon it back toward Chattanooga and the Union lines. The daring adventure of which I now speak was, however, far more successful than this bold scouting in Georgia. While Northern Virginia and Maryland were in the icy embrace of midwinter, a small squad of plucky Confederates from Captain McNeill's partisan Rangers rode at night into Cumberland, Maryland, where 5,000 armed men of the Union Army were stationed. These audacious young Confederates eluded the Union Guards, located the headquarters of Major Generals Crook and Kelly, captured them in their beds, and brought them, as prisoners of war mounted on their own horses, safely into Confederate lines. General Crook was the distinguished commander of the Union troops whose flank and rear my command had struck at dawn on Cedar Creek. When he was brought to headquarters as prisoner, General Early interviewed him in reference to that battle. Captain Hotchkiss states that in the interview General Crook represented the 6th Corps on the morning of the 19th of October at Cedar Creek, as almost as badly damaged as the other corps, and in no condition to resist attack. It will not surprise the thoughtful student of this marvellous battle to know that General Early himself realized later the fatal mistake of the halt at Cedar Creek, and gave an indicative caution to his faithful staff officer, who was leaving with a sketch of Cedar Creek for General Lee. Captain Hotchkiss says, "General Early told me not to tell General Lee that we ought to have advanced in the morning at Middletown, for, said he, we ought to have done so. Anything more on this point would be superfluous. I should not have felt it necessary to produce these proofs as to the responsibility of the halting and delay, but for the fact that they bear directly and cogently upon the other infinitely more important inquiry. Was the bad conduct of the troops, wholly or partially, directly or remotely, responsible for that evening disaster? Posterity may not trouble itself much about the halting and hesitation at Cedar Creek, but posterity, undoubtedly Confederate posterity, will be profoundly interested in this inquiry. Did Confederate officers and men abandon their posts of duty and danger to plunder the captured camps, and thus convert one of the most brilliant of victories into a most disastrous defeat and utter rout? This charge so directly, so vitally concerns the reputation, the honour, the character of Southern soldiers. It concerns all American soldiers, for these men were Americans of purest blood, as to demand the most exhaustive examination. Let the fiercest searchlight of historical scrutiny be turned upon those men. Let the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth go to posterity. With the purpose of contributing to this end, I shall incorporate, not in footnotes but in the body of this chapter, all the important and trustworthy evidence at my command bearing upon this question, which is the gravest that has ever been asked, or could be asked, concerning Confederate soldiers. I shall give proofs which cannot be called in question, in extracts from the official reports and written statements of all the prominent Confederate actors in that battle, so far as I can possibly procure them. To begin with, I quote fully and carefully from General Early's reports to General Lee, which I did not see until they were published by the government in the records of the War of the Rebellion. In his dispatch, dated October 20th, 1864, speaking of his troops, General Early says, "But for their bad conduct, I should have defeated Sheridan's whole force." In his more formal report of October 21st, speaking of an order said to have been sent to Kershaw and Gordon to advance, he says, "They stated in reply that their ranks were so depleted by the number of men who had stopped in the camps to plunder that they could not advance." In the same report on the same page, he says, "So many of our men had stopped in camp to plunder, in which I am sorry to say that officers participated," etc. Again, in another connection, he says, "We had within our grasp a glorious victory, and lost it by the uncontrollable propensity to plunder in the first place, and the subsequent panic, which was without sufficient cause," etc. In another connection, speaking of the efforts to guard against plundering, he says, "The truth is, we have few field and company officers worth anything," etc. Before closing his report, he again says, "But the victory already gained was lost by the subsequent bad conduct of the troops." Before introducing the array of witnesses and the incontrovertible facts which overwhelmingly vindicate these chivalrous and self-sacrificing men, I wish to say, as a matter of simple justice to General Early, that he was misled. His place was at the front, and after he came upon the field he was there as he always was when duty called him. No soldier or citizen was braver or more loyally devoted to our cause than Jubal A. Early. But as General Lee once said of another, he was very pertinacious of his opinions, and when once formed he rarely abandoned them. He fought against secession and for the Union until it was broken. He tied his faith to the Confederacy and fought for that while it lived, and he did not abandon its cause until both the Confederacy and himself were dead. He had been led to believe that his men at Cedar Creek had left their places in line to gather the tempting debris from the Federal wreck, and he steadfastly stood by this statement. Little wonder, then, that there should be the contention which Captain Hotchkiss has noted. General Kershaw is dead, but were he living he would unite with me, as shown by the reports of his officers, in the statement that no such order ever reached us as the one which General Early sent. No reply was ever returned by General Kershaw or myself to the effect that we could not advance. The truth is, we were not only urgently anxious to advance, but were astounded at any halt whatever. Our troops were not absent. They were there in line, eager to advance, as will appear from the unanswerable proofs submitted. General Evans, who commanded my division while I commanded the 2nd Corps in the morning victory, says, "When you congratulated me on the field immediately after our great victory, I was so impressed by your remarks as to be convinced that we would at once pursue our advantage. I had small details sent over the ground we had traversed in order to bring up every man who had fallen out for any cause except for wounds. When the attack, afternoon, came from the enemy, my command was not straggling and plundering. I wish I could see my men fully vindicated as to their conduct in this battle." General Cullen A. Battle says, "I saw no plundering at Cedar Creek, not even a straggler. My troops were in the best possible condition." In another statement he says, "I never saw troops behave better than ours did at Cedar Creek." Major General Wharton, who was in the best possible position to know if there was any straggling or plundering, uses these words, "The report of the soldiers straggling and pillaging the enemy's camps is not correct." I had a pretty fair view of a large part of the field over which you had driven the enemy. It is true that there were parties passing over the field and perhaps pillaging, but most of them were citizens, teamsters, and persons attached to the quartermasters and other departments, and perhaps a few soldiers who had taken the wounded to the rear. No, General, the disaster was not due to the soldiers leaving their commands and pillaging. Of all the reports of Cedar Creek which have been published in the war records, not one except General Early's alone remotely hints at plundering as the cause of that unprecedented revulsion after the morning victory. Only 2 of those reports refer to the matter in any way whatever, and in both the language completely exonerates these devoted men. General Brian Grimes, who was promoted to command of Ramseur's division, says, "Up to the hour of 4 p.m. the troops of this division, both officers and men, with a few exceptions, behaved most admirably and were kept well in hand, but little plundering and only a few shirking duty." He adds, "Major Whiting, Inspector, rendered signal service by preventing all straggling and plundering." John E. Winston, in his report, same Vorligesches Pound 608, says, "The men went through a camp just as it was deserted, with hats, boots, blankets, tents, and such things as tempt our soldiers scattered over it, and after diligent inquiry I heard of but one man who even stopped to pick up a thing. He got a hat and has charges preferred against him." He refers with pride to the splendid conduct of these troops, etc. That gallant soldier J. M. Goggin, who commanded Connor's brigade of Kershaw's division in his official report, says, "Up to this time, the afternoon assault by Sheridan, both men and officers had obeyed with commendable cheerfulness and alacrity all orders given them. I cannot forbear giving both officers and men that praise, which is so justly their due for the noble display of all the admirable and true qualities of the soldier up to the time the retreat was ordered, and no one who witnessed the advance of the brigade that day against different positions of the enemy will hesitate to bestow upon it his unqualified admiration. While almost any one of these pointed and just testimonials would be a sufficient vindication of these self-immolating veterans, yet I must introduce here the most comprehensive statement of all. It was written by the Rev. A.C. Hopkins, now pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Charlestown, West Virginia. He was, during the war, one of the leading Confederate chaplains. In the different battles he was present, mingling with the soldiers, caring for the wounded, and doing admirable service in encouraging the men who were on the fighting line. No dangers deterred him, no sacrifices were too great for him to make. Dr. Hopkins was one of those sterling characters who esteemed honour and truth as of far greater value than life itself. In the carefully prepared statement which he wrote of Cedar Creek, he says, "The writer was a free lance that day, and all over the field from rear to front, from the time Gordon struck Crook's lines at daybreak till the afternoon. He was sometimes with our lines, and sometimes with the wounded, over the field and through the Yankee camps. It is true that many men straggled and plundered, but they were men who in large numbers had been wounded in the summer's campaign, who had come up to the army for medical examination, and who came like a division down the pike behind Wharton, and soon scattered over the field and camps and helped themselves. They were soldiers more or less disabled, and not on duty. This body I myself saw as they came on the battlefield and scattered. They were not men with guns. But there can be no doubt that General Early mistook them for men who had fallen out of ranks." In speaking of that contention between General Early and myself, which was evoked by this serious misapprehension as to the bad conduct of our brave men, Dr. Hopkins says, "Nearly all the inspectors who sent reports for 19th October to General Gordon either gave the numbers of men carried up to the lines during the day or vindicated their commands from General Early's imputation. And these inspectors' reports were consolidated at General Gordon's headquarters and the substance forwarded in his report to General Early. Unfortunately, no inspectors' reports appear among the published records, and the records contain not one word from General Gordon on this battle. It seems to me unnecessary to lengthen this chapter by additional evidence or by any argument. The proofs already adduced compass the irrefutable vindication of the winners of the morning victory at Cedar Creek. Many of the dead commanders left on record their testimony, and it is true, I think, that every living Confederate officer who commanded at Cedar Creek a corps or division or brigade or regiment or company would testify that his men fought with unabated ardour and did not abandon their places in line to plunder the captured camps. It is truly marvellous, therefore, that the statement that their bad conduct caused the disastrous reverse has gone into books and is treated as history in all sections of the country. Even ex-President Jefferson Davis, the last man on earth who would knowingly do Confederate soldiers an injustice, was totally misled by General Early's statement. If my official report of the Battle of Cedar Creek had been forwarded to General Lee and published in the war records, I might be pardoned by my comrades and their children if I did not write as I am now writing in vindication of the men who fought so superbly and exhibited such marked self-denial in that most unique of battles. Not for my sake, but for theirs, I deeply regret the absence of my report from those records. It is only since this book was begun that my attention was called to this fact. It would seem that my report never reached General Lee. Otherwise it would have been among his papers, and assuredly have found its place in the volumes issued by the government. General Lee, however, did not agree with his lieutenant commanding in the valley as to the kind of metal these men were made of. On September 27th he wrote General Early, "I have such confidence in the men and officers that I am sure all will unite in defence of the country." These men were not strangers to General Lee. He knew them. He had seen them in the past years of the war, performing deeds of valour and exercising a self-denial the simple record of which would rival the legends of the romantic era of chivalry. They had not changed, except to grow, if possible, into a more self-sacrificing manhood as the demands upon them became more exacting. Whatever they had been in the battles around Richmond, at Fredericksburg, at Chancellorsville, at Gettysburg, at Cold Harbor, in the Wilderness, and in the great countercharge at Spotsylvania they were the same at Cedar Creek. The men who were in the captured camps were not the soldiers who fought the morning battle and won the morning victory. The plunderers, if such they may be called, were not the fiery South Carolinians who, under Kershaw, had so fearlessly and fiercely stormed and carried the Union breastworks at dawn. They were not the steadfast Virginians who, under Wharton, had rushed into the combat, adding fresh momentum to the resistless Confederate charge. They were not the men under my command, the Second Corps, which Jackson had immortalized and which had helped to immortalize him. They were not the men who, under Evans and Ramseur and Grimes and Battle and Pegram, had before daybreak plunged into the cold water to their waists or armpits, and with drenched bodies and water-soaked uniforms had warmed themselves in the hot furnace of battle. These men at Cedar Creek were heroes, descended from heroic sires, inspired by heroic women, trained to self-denial and self-sacrifice through 4 years of the most heroic of wars, and battling through cold and heat and hunger against heroic Americans. Were these the men to abandon their places in front to plunder in the rear? Who, then, were the men in the captured camps who were reported to General Early? They were men without arms, the partially disabled, whom the army surgeons had pronounced scarcely strong enough for the long and rough night march and the strenuous work of the battle. These half-sick and disabled men had come along the smooth, open pike at their leisure, when they learned of the great victory. They came thinking it no robbery to supply themselves with shoes and trousers and overcoats and blankets and grub from the vast accumulations purchased that morning by the toil and blood of their able-bodied comrades from the stores which the richly provided Federals, in their unceremonious departure, had neglected to take away. Many years have passed since the Confederate commander at Cedar Creek was misled and induced to place on record his belief as to the bad conduct of his men, a belief, I repeat, fixed in his mind by misinformation and grounded on total misapprehension. But many years had also passed after the Battle of Cold Harbor before the exculpation of the brave men of the Union Army was effected by General Horace Porter in his book, Campaigning with Grant. The refutation of that wrong, although long delayed, will be none the less appreciated by Union veterans and by all their descendants. It is not too late, I trust, for the truth, as now revealed, to vindicate these Confederates. Appeals, pathetic and earnest, have been made to me for years, the burden of which has been, I want you, before you die, to do justice to the men who fought at Cedar Creek. The stoniest heart would be moved by such appeals. They would stir the sensibilities of any man who saw those dauntless veterans on that field or who fought and suffered with them in the Confederate Army. I had a right, however, to suppose that the great war records would include my report and the inspector's reports, every one of which, I believe, without an exception, was a vindication of that little army whose valour and scrupulous soldierly bearing has never been surpassed. I protested at the time against the injustice done them, hence the contention recorded by Captain Hotchkiss. I left the substance of that protest in permanent form, but that is lost. And now I esteem it one of the most imperative duties devolving upon me to do all in my power to guide the future historian to a clear apprehension of the truth in regard to the chivalrous character and conduct of these loyal men. Although the unparalleled wrong which, through misapprehension, was done them may have already crystallized in war records and so-called histories, yet I shall live and die in the confident hope that the irrefutable proofs herein adduced, which have never before been grouped and marshalled, will stand as their complete though tardy vindication. No man, I think, has a higher or more just appreciation than myself of our Confederate leaders, but the brilliant victories won by our arms will be found, in their last analyses, to be in a large measure due to the strong individuality, the deep-seated convictions, the moral stamina, the martial instinct, and the personal prowess of our private soldiers. And in no divisions of Lee's army were these characteristics more completely developed than in those which fought at Cedar Creek. Chapter 26. The Last Winter of the War. The Cedar Creek catastrophe did not wholly dispirit Early's army, nor greatly increase the aggressive energy of Sheridan's. It was the last of the great conflicts in the historic valley which for 4 years had been torn and blood-stained by almost incessant battle. Following on Cedar Creek were frequent skirmishes, some sharp tilts with Sheridan's cavalry, a number of captures and losses of guns and wagons by both sides, and an amount of marching often 20 to 25 miles a day that sorely taxed the bruised and poorly shod feet of the still cheerful Confederates. On November 16th, Captain Hotchkiss made this memorandum in his journal. Sent a document to Colonel Boteler showing that to this date we had marched, since the opening of the campaign, 1,670 miles, and had 75 battles and skirmishes. All of the encounters which followed Cedar Creek, however, would not have equalled in casualties a second-rate battle. But they served to emphasize the fact that neither commander was disposed to bring the other to a general engagement. Evidently, the grievous castigation which each received at Cedar Creek had left him in the sad plight of the Irishman, who, recovering from an attack of grippe, declared that it was the worst disease he ever had, for it kept him sick 4 months after he got well. During this period of Union and Confederate convalescence, I was transferred by General Lee's orders to the lines of defense around the beleaguered Confederate capital and its sympathizing sister city, Petersburg. My command, the 2nd Corps, consisted of the divisions of Evans, Grimes, and Pegram. Before dawn on December 8th, the long trains were bearing 2 divisions of my command up the western slope of the Blue Ridge Range, which separated that hitherto enchanting valley from the undulating Piedmont region, which Thomas Jefferson thought was some day to become the most populous portion of our country, because so richly endowed by nature. As I stood on the back platform of the last car in the train and looked back upon that stricken valley, I could but contrast the aspect of devastation and woe which it then presented with the bounty and peace in all its homes at the beginning of the war. Prior to 1862 it was, if possible, more beautiful and prosperous than the famed bluegrass region of Kentucky. Before the blasting breath of war swept over its rich meadows and fields of clover, they had been filled with high-mettled horses, herds of fine cattle, and flocks of sheep that rivaled England's best. These were all gone. The great water wheels, which 4 years before had driven the busy machinery of the mills, were motionless, standing and rotting, the silent vouchers of wholesale destruction. Heaps of ashes, of half-melted iron axles and bent tyres, were the melancholy remains of burnt barns and farm wagons and implements of husbandry. Stone and brick chimneys, standing alone in the midst of charred trees which once shaded the porches of luxurious and happy homes, told of hostile torches which had left these grim sentinels the only guards of those sacred spots. At the close of this campaign of General Sheridan, there was in that entire fertile valley, the former American Arcadia, scarcely a family that was not struggling for subsistence. Among the excellent soldiers who participated in all that valley campaign was a Virginian, who is now Dr. Charles H. Harris of Cedartown, Georgia. Dr. Harris's high character as a man and his familiarity with the facts justify me in giving his written account of the marvellous fatality which attended the representatives of a Virginia family which contributed perhaps a larger number of soldiers to the Confederate Army than any other in the southern states. 2 companies of the 60th Virginia Regiment were enlisted in and around Christiansburg, which seems to have received its name from the family which contributed 18 of its members, brothers and cousins, to those 2 Confederate companies. These 18 kinsmen had inherited their love of liberty from revolutionary ancestors, and had imbibed from the history and traditions of the Old Dominion those lofty ideals of manhood of which her great people are so justly proud. When, therefore, Virginia passed the solemn ordinance of secession and cast her lot with that of her sister states, these high-spirited young men enlisted in the Confederate Army. I recall nothing in history or even in romance which equals in uniqueness and pathos the fate that befell them. The decrees of that fate were uniform and inexorable. One by one these kinsmen fell in succeeding engagements. In every fight in which the regiment was engaged, one of this brave family was numbered among the dead. as battle succeeded battle, and each with appalling regularity claimed its victim, there ran through company and regiment the unvarying question: which one of the Christians was killed today, and which one will go next? Yet among the survivors there was no wavering, no effort to escape the doom which seemed surely awaiting each in his turn. With a consecration truly sublime, each took his place in line, ready for the sacrifice which duty demanded. For 17 successive engagements, the gruesome record of death had not varied. Then came Cedar Creek. Only one of the gallant 18 was left. His record for courage was unsurpassed. A number of times he had been wounded, and in the deadly hand-to-hand struggle at Cold Harbour he had been pierced by a bayonet. Faithful to every duty, he had never missed a fight. When the orders were issued for the night march and the assault at dawn upon Sheridan's army, a deep fraternal concern for this last survivor of the Christians was manifested by all of his comrades. He was privately importuned to stay out of the fight, or, if unwilling to remain in camp while his comrades fought, he was urged to go home. Whether he yielded to these warnings and entreaties will probably never be known. He was seen by his comrades no more after that night march to Cedar Creek. Many believe that he was loyal even unto death, and that he lies with the heroic and unknown dead who fell upon that eventful field. On reaching Petersburg, it fell to my lot to hold the extreme right of Lee's infantry. In front of this exposed wing was a dense second growth of pines, in which the daring scouts of both armies often passed each other at night and found hiding places during their adventures. This forest also served to conceal the movements of troops and made artillery practically useless. Behind my position was the South Side Railroad, the last of the long commercial arteries that had not been cut. General Grant saw that to cut it was to starve Lee's army, and this meant the death of the Confederacy. His constant aim, therefore, was to seize and sever it. My instructions were to prevent this at any cost. The winter rains and snows and boggy roads were my helpers, and no great battles ensued. There were, however, occasional demonstrations of Grant's purpose, and he managed to keep us alert night and day. It was a very lame railroad, even when left without federal interference. The iron rails were nearly worn out, and there were no new ones to replace them. If the old and badly maimed locomotives broke down, there were few or no facilities for repairing them. So that if the supplies had been in the far south, this crippled road could not have brought them to us. But like the woman who said that she had but one tooth above and one below, but thank God they hit, we felicitated ourselves that the shackling engines did fit the old track and could help us somewhat. The commissary informed me, soon after my troops were in their new position, that it was impossible for the government to supply us with more than half rations, and that even these were by no means certain. My different commands, therefore, were at once instructed to send wagons into the back country and remote settlements and purchase everything obtainable that would sustain life. But suppose the teams and wagons are attacked and captured by raiding parties? That chance must not deter you. Men are worth more than mules and wagons, and we shall have no men unless we can feed them, I replied. This haphazard method of feeding the corps proved to be the best then available, and later I had the satisfaction of receiving General Lee's congratulations. In one of General Grant's efforts to break through my lines, General John Pegram, one of my most accomplished commanders, fell, his blood reddening the white snow that carpeted the field. He had just married Miss Carey of Baltimore, one of the South's most beautiful and accomplished women. Thus, within a few months, ravenous war had claimed as victims 2 distinguished officers of my command, almost immediately after their marriages. One of these was Pegram of Virginia, the other was Lamar of Georgia. Christmas, December 25th, 1864, came while we were fighting famine within and Grant without our lines. To meet either was a serious problem. The Southern people from their earliest history had observed Christmas as the great holiday season of the year. It was the time of times, the longed-for period of universal and innocent, but almost boundless jollification among young and old. In towns and on the plantations, purse strings were loosened and restraints relaxed. So relaxed that even the fun-loving Negro slaves were permitted to take some liberties with their masters, to perpetrate practical jokes upon them, and before daylight to storm de white folks' houses with their merry calls. Christmas gift, master. Christmas gift, everybody. The holiday, however, on Hatcher's Run, near Petersburg, was joyless enough for the most misanthropic. The one worn-out railroad running to the far south could not bring to us half enough necessary supplies, and even if it could have transported Christmas boxes of good things, the people at home were too depleted to send them. They had already impoverished themselves to help their struggling government, and large areas of our territory had been made desolate by the ravages of marching armies. The brave fellows at the front, however, knew that their friends at home would gladly send them the last pound of sugar in the pantry and the last turkey or chicken from the barnyard. So they facetiously wished each other Merry Christmas as they dined on their wretched fare. There was no complaining, no repining, for they knew their exhausted country was doing all it could for them. At my headquarters on that Christmas day there was unusual merrymaking. Mrs. Gordon, on leaving home 4 years before, had placed in her little army trunk a small package of excellent coffee, and had used it only on very special occasions. To celebrate, as she said, our victories in the first years, and to sustain us in defeat at the last. When I asked her, on the morning of December 25th, 1864, what we could do for a Christmas celebration, she replied, "I can give you some of that coffee which I brought from home." She could scarcely have made an announcement more grateful to a hungry Confederate. Coffee, genuine coffee. The aroma of it filled my official family with Epicurean enthusiasm before a cup was passed from the boiling pot. If every man of us was not intoxicated by that indulgence after long and enforced abstinence, the hilarity of the party was misleading. The left of my line rested on the west bank of Hatcher's Run. A.P. Hill's corps was on the east side, with its right flank upon the same stream. The commanding general directed that I build a fort at the left of my line, and that A.P. Hill construct a similar one near it on the opposite side of the run. General Hill became ill after the order was received, and the construction of his fort was not pressed. Indeed, the weather was so severe and the roads so nearly impassable that there was no urgent necessity for haste. General Lee, however, who habitually interested himself in the smaller as well as the larger matters connected with his army, did not forget these forts. Riding up to my headquarters on a cold morning in January 1865, he requested me to ride with him to see the forts. As I mounted, he said, "We will go by General's quarters and ask him to accompany us, and we will examine both forts." When this officer joined us, he was temporarily in command of Hill's corps during the latter's absence on sick leave. General Lee at once asked, "General Gordon, how are you getting along with your fort?" "Very well, sir. It is nearly finished." Turning to the other officer, he asked, "Well, General, how is the work upon your fort progressing?" This officer, who had felt no special responsibility for the fort as he was only temporarily in charge, was considerably embarrassed by the general's pointed inquiry. He really had little or no knowledge of the amount of work done upon it, but ventured, after some hesitation, the reply, "I think the fort on my side of the run is also about finished, sir." Passing by my work after a short halt, we rode to the point at which the A.P. Hill fort was to be located. No fort was there. The work was scarcely begun. General Lee reined up his horse, and looking first at the place where the fort was to be, and then at the officer, he said, "General, you say the fort is about finished?" "I must have misunderstood my engineers, sir." "But you did not speak of your engineers. You spoke of the fort as nearly completed." This officer was riding a superb animal which General Lee knew had been presented to his wife.